I want to start with a list. Not a dramatic list, not a curated selection, a list I made by doing something very simple. I spent 3 weeks looking at the founding dates of the major civic buildings in the world's capital cities. Not the cities themselves, the buildings, the opera houses, the city halls, the central train stations, the national libraries, the grand boulevards, the courthouses, the customs houses, the central post offices, the structures that we think of as the bones of a modern city. And what I found when I wrote those dates down in a column and looked at them was something I wasn't prepared for. The dates are the same, not approximately the same, not within the same half-century, the same decade. Paris, London, Vienna, Berlin, Chicago, Buenos Aires, Melbourne, Cairo, Tokyo, Bombay, Calcutta, St. Petersburg, Brussels, Amsterdam, Budapest, city after city after city. The central civic infrastructure that defines what those places look like today was built, or according to the official record, rebuilt, within a window so compressed that when you put the dates side by side, it stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like a schedule. I want to be precise about what I'm claiming. I'm not saying all these buildings share the same architectural style, though many of them do in ways that deserve their own episode. I'm not saying they were built by the same people, though the financing structures are worth examining closely. I'm saying something simpler and in some ways more troubling. An extraordinary proportion of the world's major cities underwent their foundational civic reconstruction within a period stretching from roughly 1855 to 1890, with a sharp concentration in the years between 1860 and 1878. And the official explanation for each of them is local. A fire, a revolution, a modernization initiative, a visionary mayor, local explanations for a global pattern. That's where I've been spending my time. Let me start with the most famous case because I think it's the one where the frame has been most successfully established. Everyone knows that Paris was rebuilt by Baron Haussmann under Napoleon III. It's taught in architecture schools, in urban planning programs, in history courses. The demolition of medieval Paris, the creation of the grand boulevards, the standardized Haussmann apartment blocks, the reorganized arrondissements, the new sewer system. It's presented as the definitive example of authoritarian urban modernization. One man, one emperor, one vision, one city. A case study in top-down planning. The dates run from 1853 to 1870. But here's what I kept coming back to when I looked at this story carefully. The Paris that was demolished, the Paris that Haussmann's crews tore down over 17 years, was not a decaying slum in the way the official narrative implies. Some of it was dense and old, yes. But the demolition records, when you read them carefully, include the systematic removal of structures that were by 19th century standards not decrepit, not unsanitary, not structurally compromised. There are streets in what is now the 1st and 4th arrondissements where demolition orders were issued for buildings that had standing walls, functional roofs and occupied interiors. The official justification was sanitation and traffic flow, but the structures being removed in those specific cases weren't particularly insanitary, and the streets being widened in many cases ran through areas of the city where foot traffic, not cart traffic, was the primary use. The demolition was thorough in a way that exceeded the stated functional requirement. Here's what that particular observation opened up. When you remove a building that is functioning, that is occupied, that is not condemned by any structural criterion, you are not doing maintenance. You are making a choice about what the city should contain. And when that choice is made simultaneously, with similar thoroughness, in a dozen cities across different continents, under different governments, in different languages, within the same 20-year window, the question that demands an answer is not what were they building. The question is, what were they replacing? What strikes me most in the Haussmann documentation is a phrase that appears more than once across different administrative records. Structures of indeterminate provenance. Buildings described not as unsafe, not as unsanitary, but as impossible to account for. As though the problem wasn't their condition but their existence. as though someone had looked at them and found that they couldn't be explained by the history that was being written around them and had decided on that basis that they needed to go. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let me give you another data point. Vienna. The Ringstrasse project was launched formally in 1857 with an imperial decree from Franz Joseph I. The construction of the Vienna Ring Road and its accompanying civic buildings transformed what had been the fortified medieval core of the Habsburg capital into the neoclassical boulevard city we recognise today. The Opera House, 1869. The Parliament, 1883. The City Hall, 1883. The Berg Theatre, 1888. The Natural History Museum and Art History Museum, both 1891. The University, 1884. Enormous, coordinated, constructed in neo-Gothic, neo-Renaissance, neo-classical styles, selected deliberately to evoke a specific version of European civilization. To look, in other words, ancient. To look as though they had always been there, but they hadn't always been there. What had been there was demolished. The old fortification walls, yes, but also the structures within the glacis, the cleared military zone that had surrounded the inner city. And in the inner city itself, buildings of uncertain age and origin that the demolition orders described in terms I find striking. Structures of no historical value, buildings of indeterminate provenance, establishments unsuitable for a modern capital. Again, local explanation, specific decree, specific emperor. The official story is self-contained, except that the same language, structures of no historical value, buildings of indeterminate provenance, appears in the demolition documents for Haussmann's Paris, and in the urban renewal documentation for central London under the Metropolitan Board of Works, street improvement schemes of the 1860s and 1870s, and in the planning documents for the reconstruction of Chicago after the Great Fire of 1871, and in the urban reorganization records for central Cairo under Khedive Ismail in the 1860s and 1870s. Indeterminate provenance, that phrase. In French records and German records and English records and Ottoman adjacent records in the same compressed historical window. What does it mean to demolish a building because its provenance is indeterminate? It means you are removing something you cannot explain. And if you are doing that across multiple continents simultaneously, it means the thing you cannot explain may be considerably more significant than any local administrative record is prepared to acknowledge. Let me take the Chicago fire of 1871 as a case study, because it's the most dramatic American example and because the reconstruction that followed it is genuinely extraordinary in its speed, its scale, and its architectural ambition. The fire occurred on October 8th and 9th, 1871. It destroyed approximately 2,000 acres of central Chicago, roughly 17,000 buildings, and left an estimated 100,000 people homeless. By any standard, a catastrophe. The official narrative is well established. Dry conditions, a city built primarily of wood, a fire department overwhelmed by scale. Tragedy, explanation, recovery, but here's what the construction records show. Within 5 years of the fire, Chicago had not simply rebuilt. It had become architecturally different in kind from what had existed before. Not just repaired, transformed. The first skyscrapers, the first steel frame buildings, the first modern building codes, the first systematic underground utility grid, the home insurance building widely considered the world's first skyscraper, completed in 1885, 14 years after the fire. The Rookery, 1888. The Auditorium Building, 1889. The Monadnock Building, 1893. What the fire created was not merely a reconstruction opportunity. It created a cleared site on which a new kind of city could be built. A city whose architectural ambition could not have been inserted gradually into an existing urban fabric. Not without demolition on a scale that would have been politically impossible without the justification of catastrophe. This raises a simple but critical question. When does a fire stop being a fire and start being an urban renewal project. I want to be clear, I'm not claiming the Chicago fire was intentionally set. I'm noting that the reconstruction it enabled was of a scale and type that the city's existing structure would not have accommodated otherwise. And I'm noting that the reconstruction followed a pattern in its financing, in its architectural ambition, in its civic vocabulary that is visible in other cities that did not have catastrophic fires to justify their transformation. Cities that simply decided in the same decade to rebuild. And I'm noting something else. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 was not the only significant urban fire of that period. The Great Boston Fire of 1872, the Great Seattle Fire of 1889, the San Francisco Fire of 1906, a series of devastating urban fires in the second half of the 19th century, each of which cleared a city centre and enabled a reconstruction that followed the same architectural and civic template, each with a local explanation, each producing a globally consistent result. The official explanation collapses here, not at any individual fire, but at the pattern. Let me move quickly through some of the other cases because I want you to feel the weight of the accumulation. Melbourne. Population exploding through the 1850s gold rush. The city underwent its foundational civic reconstruction in the 1870s and 1880s. Parliament House begun 1856, significantly expanded through the 1870s. The Royal Exhibition Building 1880. The State Library 1856 with major expansion in the 1870s. The Post Office, the Customs House, the Law Courts, the Melbourne Town Hall, all reconstructed or constructed in a compressed period from the mid-1850s to the early 1890s. The financing came through colonial bonds issued in London. The architectural firms were in many cases European, working from pattern books circulated across the British colonial world. The style invariably neoclassical, neo-Gothic, or neo-Renaissance, always neo, always an evocation of something older that the building itself is not. Buenos Aires. After the federalization of the city in 1880, an astonishing construction program transformed what had been a modest port city into a self-consciously European-styled capital. The Casa Rosada significantly expanded. The National Congress building begun. The Teatro Colón, whose final building would open in 1908, had its institutional foundation in this period. The grand boulevards of the Avenida de Mayo. The architects were European. The financing was primarily British. The style was neoclassical. The dates, 1880 to 1900, with the most intensive construction in the mid-1880s. Cairo. Khedive Ismail, educated in Paris, explicitly modelled his reconstruction of central Cairo on Haussmann's Paris. The demolition of old Cairo neighbourhoods. The construction of broad European-style boulevards. The Opera House, opened in 1869 specifically for the celebration surrounding the opening of the Suez Canal. European architects, European financing, European style, 1860s and 1870s, Tokyo. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 initiated what is described as Japan's rapid modernization. Within 15 years, the government quarter of Tokyo had been systematically rebuilt in European architectural styles. The Rokumeikan, a Western-style social club, opened 1883. The Bank of Japan completed 1896. The government ministries, the courts, the central post office, all rebuilt in neoclassical style within a window of roughly 1870 to 1900. The architects, in several cases, were European. The pattern books were European. The financing structures were integrated with European banking systems. Bombay, the great Gothic civic buildings of what is now Mumbai, the Victoria Terminus, now Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Terminus, completed 1887. The Bombay Municipal Corporation Building, 1893. The Bombay High Court, 1878. The University of Bombay Library and Rajabai Clock Tower, 1878. Each constructed in a self-consciously Gothic or Indo-Gothic style designed to evoke European antiquity in a South Asian context. Colonial financing, European architecture, same decade. Brussels, St. Petersburg, Amsterdam, Budapest, whose extraordinary Parliament building, modelled on the Palace of Westminster and completed in 1902, was designed in a neo-Gothic style that its architects described as expressing Hungary's ancient constitutional traditions. Traditions that the building itself, having been completed 600 years after those traditions supposedly originated, made no attempt to claim it actually descended from. The official explanation for all of these simultaneously is modernization. Each country, each city, each government independently decided in the same generation that the future looked like neoclassical European civic architecture, that the train station should have a grand hall, that the opera house should have a columned facade, that the boulevard should be wide enough for military parades, that the city hall should announce itself with a tower, that the style that expressed civilizational authority was the neoclassical, neo-Gothic, neo-Renaissance vocabulary that appears with measurably consistent proportions across every jurisdiction where this reconstruction took place. But here's what the official explanation of independent simultaneous modernization cannot account for: the pattern books. There exist, in the archival collections of several European institutions, standardized architectural pattern books circulating from the 1840s onward that appear to have been distributed across every jurisdiction where this reconstruction took place. The same column proportions, the same facade treatments, the same cornice profiles, the same window spacing appearing in Melbourne, in Buenos Aires, in Cairo, in Bombay, in Chicago, in Vienna, in Paris. Not approximately similar, measurably, demonstrably similar, not because great minds think alike, but because they were working from the same documents. Who distributed those documents? Through what institutional network? Funded by whom and toward what common purpose? The official story doesn't quite have an answer for that. The official story says parallel development, diffusion of ideas, the natural spread of the dominant aesthetic of the period. But the dominant aesthetic of what period? The neoclassical vocabulary these buildings deploy is not the aesthetic of 19th century European culture. It's an imitation of something much older. These buildings are built to look like they come from a civilization that the builders themselves placed in antiquity, in ancient Rome, in ancient Greece, in a past that by the 1870s was already being presented as irretrievably distant and essentially different from the present. And here's where something quietly strange enters the picture. Many of the buildings constructed in this global reconstruction wave were described at the time of their construction as restorations, not as new buildings, as restorations of what had previously stood. The Vienna Rathaus, the new city hall built between 1872 and 1883, was described by its architect, Friedrich Schmidt, as restoring the city to its proper Gothic character. The Paris Opera, completed 1875, was described in its promotional materials as expressing the true spirit of the city's cultural inheritance. The Budapest Parliament building was presented as giving permanent architectural form to constitutional traditions that its architects spoke of as ancient, as essential, as always having deserved this physical expression. These are new buildings presenting themselves as the proper continuation of an older tradition, which raises the question, what was the older tradition they were claiming to continue? And what had been there before they were built that did not express that tradition sufficiently? Because in every city I looked at, the demolition records and the construction records share a temporal overlap. The destruction of indeterminate provenance structures and the construction of neoclassical, neo-Gothic, neo-Renaissance civic buildings happen at the same time. Not first demolish, then build, simultaneously. As though the one was a precondition for the other. As though the new buildings required not just physical space but a cleared conceptual field. A history that had been tidied away before the official history was installed in its place. Here is where I have to talk about the money, because without the money, none of this happens. And the money, when you trace it, is one of the most remarkable aspects of the entire pattern. The global civic reconstruction of the 1860s through 1890s required capital on an extraordinary scale. A single major civic building project in this period, the Vienna Opera House, the Chicago Auditorium Building, the Melbourne Royal Exhibition Building, might cost the equivalent of hundreds of millions in contemporary terms. Multiply that across dozens of cities, dozens of countries, and you are talking about one of the largest coordinated deployments of capital in human history up to that point. And the capital had to come from somewhere. When you trace the bond structures, the loan agreements, the investment houses that underwrote these projects, you find something that the official financial history of this period has documented but rarely examined from this angle. The financing for the Vienna Ringstrasse came primarily through the Creditanstalt Bank and its European partners. The financing for the Melbourne public buildings came through colonial bonds issued and serviced through London. The financing for the Buenos Aires reconstruction came primarily through Baring Brothers in London and its Argentine partners. The financing for Cairo's European-style reconstruction came through a consortium of European banks closely connected to the financing of the Suez Canal itself. The financing for the Japanese government's architectural modernization came through relationships established with European financial institutions in the 1870s and 1880s. The same financial network, not loosely connected, not coincidentally adjacent. The same interlocking set of European banking houses, primarily London-based, occasionally Paris-based, and connected through documented partnerships and family relationships, simultaneously financing the physical reconstruction of the world's major cities in a single generation. The same network, it should be noted, that was simultaneously financing colonial resource extraction, and the same network that was simultaneously financing the enclosure of what I've discussed in earlier episodes as the world's food commons. This raises a simple but critical question. Is it possible that controlling what a city looks like and controlling what a city eats from are not separate projects? Is it possible that the physical reconstruction of the world's cities, the installation of the neoclassical vocabulary, the demolition of structures of indeterminate provenance, the creation of the Grand Boulevard and the formal park and the civic monument is part of the same coordinated action as the enclosure of the food forests and the reclassification of communal land? Different instruments of the same underlying intention? I'm not prepared to answer that definitively, but I'm no longer prepared to treat it as a coincidence. Let me close with the observation that stays with me. When you visit the historic centres of the world's capital cities, what you are almost always looking at is the product of this single window of reconstruction. The Paris you photograph, the Vienna you walk through, the Chicago loop you navigate, the central Melbourne you film, the downtown Buenos Aires you admire. These are not ancient cities. They are cities that were rebuilt or built from near scratch in a 30 to 40 year window in the second half of the 19th century. The buildings that look oldest are in many cases the ones most recently built to look old. The structures with the most apparent weight of history are often the structures whose documented histories begin not in any deep past but in the 1860s or the 1870s. And the cities they replaced, the medieval Paris, the fortified Vienna, the wooden Chicago, the older Cairo neighbourhoods, those cities exist now only in records, in the occasional surviving photograph, in the demolition orders that describe their structures as being of indeterminate provenance and no historical value. In scattered pre-demolition surveys that recorded what was there before the clearance crews arrived, surveys that now sit in archival collections rarely consulted, rarely digitized, rarely brought into conversation with the reconstruction records that document what replaced what they recorded. There is a layer of the world's cities that was removed in a single generation, deliberately, thoroughly, with financing that we can trace, with architectural specifications that we can find, with demolition language that appears across jurisdictions with unsettling consistency. And in its place was installed a standardized civic vocabulary, a set of buildings designed to look ancient, to look authoritative, to look as though they had always been there and had always looked exactly this way. I don't know what was removed. I have looked at enough records to be confident that what was described as indeterminate and irregular and unsuitable for a modern capital was in many cases structurally sound, productively occupied, and genuinely old. Old in a way that didn't fit the timeline being installed around it. Old in a way that the official histories of those cities have never satisfactorily explained, perhaps because explaining it would require asking how old, and asking how old would require asking what was there before the period those histories are willing to begin from. And I keep returning to the same question I cannot answer. Not who did this, though the financing records suggest a very small number of connected interests. Not when, though the precision of the window is remarkable. Not even how, though the architectural pattern books and the bond markets and the demolition orders tell a coherent enough story once you put them in the same frame. The question underneath all of it is simpler and harder. What did the buildings know? What did the structures of indeterminate provenance, the ones whose demolition was prioritized, the ones described as unsuitable and irregular and of no historical value, what did they represent about the history of the places where they stood? What would we understand about Vienna, about Paris, about Chicago, about Cairo, about Melbourne, if we could walk through the neighbourhoods that were cleared to build the cities we now photograph and call historic? What would we see in those streets that the demolition orders were designed to prevent us from seeing? What would we understand about the continuity of civilization, about what came before the 19th century, about what those cities were before they were rebuilt to look like what someone in the 1860s and 1870s needed them to look like, that we cannot now understand because the evidence was classified as being of no historical value and removed? I don't know. And the silence in the records where the answer should be is, by now, a familiar shape. Somewhere in the demolition orders, in the architectural competitions, in the bond issuances, in the pattern books that moved from London and Paris to every corner of the world in the 1860s and 1870s, there is a record of what was understood and what was removed and what was installed in its place. We are living inside the installation. We are photographing it and calling it history. And the thing it replaced, the thing described as being of no historical value, the structures of indeterminate provenance whose clearance was the precondition for everything built on top of them. That is precisely what we no longer have the means to ask about. The dates are the same. Paris, Vienna, Chicago, Cairo, Melbourne, Buenos Aires, Tokyo, Bombay, St. Petersburg, Brussels. The same decade, the same financing, the same vocabulary, the same demolition language, the same silence about what was removed. Once you see it, you can't unsee it.